Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the special council meeting of May the 30th, 2023. I'll call the meeting to order and look for an adoption of the agenda. Deputy Mayor Richardson, Councillor Warren. All in favor? And that's passed. Moving right along into presentations, item 4.1 is council orientation, legislation, policies, and procedures presentation, and I'll turn it over to CAO Ron Taylor. Sorry, is there a disclosure of pecuniary interest on anything on the agenda today? Seeing none, should any arise, please advise the chair. We'll deal with it accordingly. And one of these days, I'll remember to ask for this.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good to see everybody this afternoon. Although we are in a more formal setting, this is really meant to be an education orientation session. Hopefully everybody's comfortable. It's meant to be less formal than a standard council meeting, but we want to make sure that we cover all of the materials that we're wanting to accomplish today. We had done a robust orientation session already with you earlier in your term. And the mayor conducted sort of one-on-one meetings and checkpoints with you. And through those meetings, we provided some of the baseline policies that at least are, I call them council-facing. They're the ones that govern your day-to-day business and activities. There's certainly many more out there that govern our overall operations and services. And we're going to have those another day. But today's focus is really to complete that conversation with you about your procedural bylaws and those, again, policies that affect your day-to-day sort of business and governance. So we've got an overview slide more on topics, and we'll walk you through that. I want to make sure that you've got some of the materials to be able to reference and look at while we're going through. So in the agenda, the public agenda, we provided two sort of key documents. One is the procedural bylaw, and that we haven't gone through at all as a group. It has been provided generally for information, but we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to go through it. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. The second is the council code of conduct. You did receive a copy of that when you were onboarded to the city, and there has been some conversation already. You'll recall we had the ministry. We also had an update from the Integrity Commissioner on sort of the scope and scale of that particular policy. But there's a couple of items that were, I'll say, unfinished business, and so we want to touch on those today. So on the overhead is really just outlining the topics that we want to go through. So again, I mentioned procedural bylaw, council policies. We do want to dig in a little bit on what closed session is. So closed meetings versus open session meetings. We want to talk about conflict of interest. We're going to talk about civil liability and limitations. We'll talk about council's roles and obligations. And that really is coming back to some of the policies that I mentioned. You heard a deputation recently about Bill 5, and so we thought it would be timely and aligned with the conversation that we're having today to give you a little bit more background and information on that. And then we'll conclude on some just general administration and future meetings, how we schedule it and move forward. So if everybody's okay with those topics, we will try to get you out in a timely manner this afternoon. That I can commit to. So what I didn't do is sort of in the overall introduction, it is mentioned in the agenda. I'll walk you through some of the items. The city clerk, Kathy Ritchie, will also touch on some of those topics. Robin Carlson, city solicitor, is online and will be touching on some of the items. And Leanna Patterson, our chief people officer, will talk a little bit as well about some of the policies and the impact. So, Mr. Mayor, if you're okay with that, and we'll go through it again. We'll try to break it up as we go through and sort of have pauses. So again, I think it's better to have sort of ongoing questions. Certainly if we can't answer them today, we're going to take them away and we'll make sure that we get you good information. So it looks like everybody's okay with the agenda and where we're heading. So let's jump right into it. So I want to start with the procedural bylaw. So hopefully everybody has a copy of it. I'm not going to put it up on the slides, but I do want to walk through it so that you're comfortable and again can ask any questions. So does everybody has a copy of that document? Okay, so essentially the procedural bylaw is just as that says. It outlines procedure for all of the business that you do, that you conduct. We're going to be talking about how it is informing for your council business. It also does inform other processes and functions, specifically other boards, other committees do have to follow the similar procedural bylaw. And it is quite, it's a great document. I think it's a really good one for you to familiarize yourself with so that you can sort of understand how the meetings function, what is your role, what can you do at meetings, what can't we do, sort of collectively, and going through it. So I'm going to start flipping through it. I will mention page numbers, and then I'll sort of pause at some of the different sections, because again, I think it is important to touch on some of the areas of this bylaw, even for seasoned veterans out there and ones that are returning, just so that we're all focused. And it was interesting, even the clerk, we were going over it again this week, and every time we go through it, there's always something new, or hey, maybe now under these new circumstances. So this is a document that we should be familiar with and we should be updating regularly. So there's a long table of contents which outlines all of the various pieces. So I'm going to flip through that. I'm now at page 10. In that section 1, it essentially sets out all of the definitions and interpretations within the bylaw. And as you can appreciate, these definitions essentially come from the Municipal Act or are aligned with the legislation that you govern under and that you're required to comply with. So I wasn't planning on touching on any of the definitions, but certainly in the Q&A we can go back to those. Section 2 talks about some general areas of interest, so that starts on page 14 of the procedural bylaw. And it talks about generalities, places of meetings, if you're changing sort of meeting locations. The one area I did want to just touch on or bring to your attention, or the first of a few, is section 2.04, which is a newer section that outlines electronic participation for you. And this is, when I say quite new, it was added in the last term of council. It was essentially added based on our pandemic experience. We had to do business. We were forced to do business sort of electronically. But as you can appreciate, it's not as simple as just jumping on and making sure that the public still has the same access to meetings, that you still have the resources available to you to make decisions, etc. So this was sort of the first iteration of outlining how you can participate electronically. And you've been doing it over the last 6 months of your tenure quite well, and sort of within sort of those parameters. We're looking at later in this term of council, expanding on this a little bit. This again was a first cut sort of in terms of provincial changes for electronic management. But we do want to look at some other add-ons, some other better resourcing for you, so that if you are forced or required or opting to participate electronically, again, that you have all of the information that's there in front of you, and that the public can, so that a meeting can run properly, and that you have the same participation that you would have in person. And again, please feel free to stop me. I don't know, Mr. Mayor, if you prefer, if it's just sort of a hand signal, or if you want to be a little bit more just through the system to identify if anybody has a question. What's your preference?
Electronically would be good, but I do, because I may be looking at the book and not see you, but I can see the screen when it comes up, so. Councillor Warren.
That was my issue too. It's kind of hard if you are online to really participate fully. I found, because I was sick for a couple meetings, and it was really difficult. It was like you almost had to shout out that you wanted to be recognized. So I know it's difficult because you've got here and then you're trying to look up too. So I don't know how you get around that issue.
Well, and I do have the clerk and deputy clerk and CAO, if they see somebody on Zoom who wants to speak, they alert me to it, but it's not always timely.
So again, I'm glad that you sort of raised that, because I think that's what we're more looking at is enhancements to it. I mean, fundamentally, I think it's here to stay, but how you're recognized, how your vote is recognized, even the information that's in front of you in terms of a report, hearing and seeing a deputation, we want to make sure that we expand on the technology and expand on the information so you have that. So that covers the electronic participation. I'll go on to the next page. Again, there are several items. I'm going to touch on a couple of additional items that have either been top of mind asked by you in this term. So section 2.08 talks about the creation of task forces. And we just created one very recently. In fact, they're coming to the end of their sort of work and mandate. And I know that there was, I don't want to say uncomfort, that's not the right term, but it was sort of, are we over sort of structuring some of these things? And I default back to the procedural bylaw and sort of that ability for the public to be able to track and inform your decisions ultimately. And so I think you're going to hear the results of that task force that was just created, just a good timely example. And I thought it was well done. I mean, in terms of setting out the parameters, setting out the work plan, and then having those meetings in a public open venue. In my mind, it really just builds a good public confidence in it, and it is a good venue for you to do roll up your sleeves type work that is ongoing. And maybe I'll just pause, Mr. Mayor. I saw that the chair of that task force had his hand up, so I'll just pause for a second.
Councillor McDonald.
Yeah, through you. Thank you. So at the end of this task force, we're finished, correct? So once we make a presentation or whatever, which you will on the 6th, that task force is no longer exists, correct?
Yes, that is correct. And in fact, and it's very deliberate. It's a task force for that exact reason. And in the procedural bylaw and in the policies, it suggests that a task force has an end term. It has a defined set of tasks or scope of work. And task forces do not transcend this term of council. So we have had some circumstances where we've had a task force established by a previous council. We make sure that when a new council is in place, if that work is continual, they need to come back and get a new refreshed mandate from the new council. So the idea is that it's not an ongoing advisory committee type structure or board. This is very specific to a particular task.
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. So as we go forward, because it was the first time that this task force, for myself and a couple of us were on, let's say next year we believe that there should be some changes done and so on there. Would there be a new task force, or would that be given to the old task force to come back to us to say, we need to do this or change things up?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So the task force current will end its mandate in June. If council wants to revisit an issue, reactivate an issue, it's really up to you what you would like to do. So if you want to reestablish the same task force, if you want to appoint a new one with a slightly different mandate, that's all fair game. and you would simply bring that forward as part of sort of your normal deliberations and recommendations. So that's just to touch on the nuance or the difference between task forces. You would have known at the beginning of your mandate, there's a number of advisory committees and boards. You are members of some of those, some of them you're not, they're volunteer committees. But essentially the procedures as well as other policies guide that particular work and how those recommendations are brought forward to you. The next section, section 2.09, direction to staff, is really just more of a reminder that you function as a body, not an individual. And so any direction that council would provide needs to be through council. So through a recommendation, through a resolution, and then staff's responsibility or the administration's responsibility is to carry out and implement your direction. It talks a bit more about that in sections 210 to 212 in particular, where it then touches on what is your specified role within the Municipal Act, talks about what is the role of the head of council, so the mayor, in governing or overseeing the council business and affairs. And then 212 touches on what are our obligations as the collective municipal administration. And I think this bylaw really does set out fundamentally what are those nuances or differences. And you would have heard that previously in the orientation. But again, if there's any comments or questions on that, sort of happy to answer those. I'm going to skip through then, if there aren't any. Section 3 talks about the inaugural meeting of council. We've already gone through that. Don't think there's anything we need to touch on there. Section 4, regular meetings of council. So Section 4 sort of outlines how you do business at those regular council meetings. Right through for process, what's in closed session, what's eligible, what's in open session, how a resolution is brought forward, what is the impact of that, etc. Section 5, page 21, talks about special and emergency meetings of council. So you've been in, you're seasoned veterans now, it's 6 months in, and so you essentially have a fixed calendar that you approved at the beginning of the term. And it runs essentially off of 2 meetings a month. Committee of the whole would be earlier in the month, and then the council meeting, the regular formal council meeting, is later in the month. And there's a few exceptions to that in the calendar, but essentially that's the baseline structure. The mayor and others have the ability to request or call a special or emergency council meeting. Obviously, emergency meaning just that, or it's very time sensitive and a decision needs to be made, and it can't be sort of timed out in your current schedule. But then there's just other special council meetings as well that you will often, or the chair will often ask for. Like today, this would be considered a special council meeting, sort of under the procedural bylaw, to outline a particular sort of set of items or agenda. I'll pause there. Go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, through you. So who are the others? I mean, staff, obviously you, the CAO, the clerk. Anybody else can call an emergency meeting, maybe fire chief. Just wondering, who are the others?
Sure. Through you, Mr. Mayor. So the chair can call it. Not even sure, like staff can't technically call an emergency meeting, needs to be approved. There's a clause, I can't remember which section, but a majority of council can call a special council meeting. You got to give notice within a certain time frame. 502. I think the deputy mayor has some ability in the absence to be able to call a special council meeting as well. And then there's a process or procedure to that. But essentially it's council focused. So it's one of the two sort of chairs, or a majority of council can call it for a particular reason. Yeah, for sure. So we'll move through then, going to go to section 6, committee of the whole. We already actually talked about that. I think you're quite comfortable with sort of the dynamics of committee of the whole. Essentially the difference is you're not sitting as council at those meetings. You're sitting as committee of the whole. It's made up of the same group, but you are providing recommendations through to council, and you're receiving sort of deputations. So no decisions are made at a committee of the whole meeting. It's intended to be slightly more informal and to allow for sort of more inputs and feedback and a time period for you as council to take that information in and then make a decision at a regular council meeting. We also have some other special committees or boards that are delegated certain authorities or powers, either from you or through the Municipal Act. So there's a planning advisory committee. I know you're familiar with that group. They provide recommendations through to council, similar to committee of the whole. So there's no decisions made at those meetings as well. And then there sometimes are other special purpose bodies or appointments or boards, again, that you either appoint or by bylaw, they're delegated certain authorities. Section 8 talks a little bit more about advisory committees and task force meetings, and essentially saying that they need to be governed similarly as council.
Councillor Ashmore.
Yep. Go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the CAO. With respect to committees of the whole, like usually you want continuity throughout the year, and usually every month there's one, and then every 2 weeks afterwards there's a council meeting. But when I look at it, the current schedule, like you have 90 days between committees of the whole from June to September. And that way, so for example, if you miss getting a memo on for next week, or which is long past, but you're going to have to wait until almost October before anything happens, like right now, because there's a 3-month gap. And just wondering why we have those big gaps. I know it's summertime and all that, but business does carry on, and I just thought maybe there would be at least one in between there, but you don't have the continuity that you think you would have.
So through the mayor, so great point, I guess, number one. I guess number two, when it was established, the idea sort of historically has been that over the summer months, just because of public participation and council as well, that we wanted to sort of lighten the load and really focus business over those 2 months. Traditionally, and I'm sort of saying sort of maybe 3-4 years ago, there was only one meeting held all summer. We've expanded that or recommended the expansion to 2, so 1 per month. And I won't speak directly for the mayor or chair, but I will suggest that as part of the summer schedule, if council had memorandums or what would typically be done on a committee of a whole agenda, there would be room for that to occur at those council meetings. So although, great question, it's not explicit sort of in this, if council wanted to bring forward memos over the summer, or deputations is another actually great example. Maybe there's a hot topic that, at a committee of the whole, we would receive more public input. It would be at the discretion of the mayor, and I know he's quite comfortable in looking at focusing those meetings to accommodate the same business.
And in addition to that, I think a couple of points. If it was necessary, we would call a special meeting in order to deal with something. And also for the rural councillors, the summertime is often busier for them because of cottage association meeting, road association meetings. A lot of the construction is going on, and residents seem to want to be more engaged at that time. And also you have a lot of your seasonal residents up during that period of time. So the summertime can actually be busier for rural councillors than the rest of the year. At least that's been my experience. You find, Councillor Ashmore?
That's fine. I wasn't aware that you could put memos onto regular council meetings, so that's going to be the new.
We would make it would have to be an exception. I mean, if it was something that was time sensitive and needed to be done, yes, we could. But I think we would try and avoid it if we possibly could.
So continue on then, Mr. Mayor. So Section 8 again talks about some of the advisory committee and task force meetings and sort of how they should proceed and be governed. Section 9 talks about some other unique meetings or types of meetings, like Drainage Board, where there's general public meetings, statutory public meetings under the Planning Act, or just other public information sessions or meetings, how they should be governed. Again, it's to be consistent. It's so that the public has an expectation that they can be heard, that they can provide inputs, and that you're getting that venue and feedback that you need to make informed decisions. So I'm going to skip over to 9.09. It's still part of some of those unique meetings, but they're town hall meetings. So these are meetings that individual council members are welcome to host and have. There hasn't been some good guidance in past terms and iterations. It's essentially been a more localized decision. But more and more, there's interest in hosting these town hall meetings. So through the last sort of terms of council, we started to put some, at least, consistency around how those are done, how they're supported by the administration as well. But it also sort of cautioning that it's not a council meeting, as you can appreciate. This is more general information in a local community or ward, etc. So there is some good information there that will help guide you in terms of how you can move forward and host those individual town hall meetings. Section 10 talks about general public attendance, so how the public interacts at a council meeting, committee meetings, etc. And outlines it in a number of different iterations, right down to the number of deputations that are permissible. Again, the whole idea is to make sure that we're all collectively operating in an open and transparent manner, that the public has access to local government and decision-making, but at the same time, ensuring that it's not unruly and that there is conduct that is followed. Because again, I know you can appreciate, you've had some hefty meetings where you have a number of deputants that want to address you. So this is to just help guide that so that business is efficient and appropriate. Skip through to section 10.11, which is on page 30. That section talks about petitions, communications, and correspondence. So again, another way that, and more, actually it's expanding quite significantly, another way that constituents and the public can communicate or have their say is through written formats, whether that's general letters, emails, petitions, correspondence, more formal, and so on. So this helps to guide how you receive that. And I think it's another area where you probably should have a second look or be familiar with that, because I appreciate you get inundated with not just sort of in-person and phone call conversations, but a lot of written material. And we want to make sure that the public, again, is getting their say, getting their input. So there's some formalities to how you receive that written correspondence as well. And how you don't. Sometimes it is just informal. It's an interaction one-on-one, might be for information. But if there's an expectation that it forms part of a decision, then we want to make sure that we're receiving it and sharing it more broadly and with all of council, because at the end of the day, it's all of council's decision versus an individual. I'll just pause there, Mr. Mayor, and see Councillor Warren.
Mr. Mayor, I came across an issue where somebody's put in a petition, and I guess the counselor didn't really follow through with it, and it's kind of just gone somewhere. So is it possible for that petition to be put forward again? It's just, that's a question. So I basically told this person to come and make a deputation at a committee of the whole meeting.
So there's always a possibility to revisit, I guess, number one. Having said that, probably be worth looking to see in this particular example, what was the action that was directed by council when, like, did council receive the petition? Yes. And then there was no more action though. In some cases, a council, you will receive that petition and refer it for some particular action. So we should probably look, because if council simply receives a petition, it doesn't, you're not saying that you're going to then do that particular request. So we have to be very deliberate, and there's many petitions that I've just sort of seen over the last couple of terms that have simply been received. They are for information, or they're like an individual comment. But unless council directs something else occur, then it stops there in essence. It's received only for information. Okay.
Is it possible, if it was just received, to bring it forward again with the counselor being part of the, bringing a motion forward or whatever, being part of their solution?
Well, again, good question as well. So if it was formally received, again, it was just that. It doesn't mean that additional action can't occur. So a counselor could look at it and say there was a petition, just like your memos is another. So there's one way. We'll talk about that when we get there, but that would be one way for you individually to bring that back. You understand there's a petition. We'd like to sort of revisit the issue, and you would make a recommendation. And if your colleagues and peers agree to that or direct a different review, then we would follow up on that and implement it. So the next one I wanted to just touch on briefly, if everybody's okay with that section, is 10.13, which is endorsement of external resolutions. And I think it's just an important one to sort of pause on, and I know you appreciate there's 444 Ontario municipalities out there. They all operate slightly different, but many of them will pass resolutions or advocacy type resolutions. And very often, in many cases, they are copying all municipalities or all like municipalities or municipalities that might have an interest in that particular topic. And sometimes they're asking for your support. And as you can appreciate, you will get inundated with these over a term of council. So trying to put some parameters around how we would manage those. Right now, essentially, we would receive those in the normal sort of course of things, share them collectively with yourselves as well as internally. And then that's kind of the screening process, if I can say it that way. If it triggers an interest or something that you individually would think or staff would think or the chair would consider something that all of council needs to take a position on, then a request would be made to bring it forward more formally. I just want to flag it because I don't want there to be that expectation that, you know, all our neighbors are sending us all of their resolutions and we're automatically putting them on an agenda so that you can weigh in on them. It would just bog down your agendas entirely. But it's certainly fair game if there's ones that align or are of interest to you and you want to bring them forward. There is mechanisms to do that. And that's what this section essentially guides for you. The next section is conduct at meetings. So how business is done, how you can bring issues forward, obviously needing quorum. And there's a number of sections that just talk about how a meeting should move forward, how you can bring motions forward, and what are their status fundamentally. So again, I won't go through those. There's many of them there. And again, I think up to this point, there hasn't been any sort of top of mind examples where in the last 6 months of your meetings, there's been some complications or confusion there that we've at least seen. But obviously, if there's any questions, again, I won't speak directly for the chair, but one of the main functions of the chair and staff is to guide you through that, so that if you have a question and you're kind of seeing something go down a path, and you want to ask a procedural question, you're always able to do that, and that's built into this bylaw as well. And we're here to help you as best we can. I don't know if there's any questions on section 11. Again, there's many pages sort of involved there. But I'll maybe just pause generally if there are any other questions. Okay. And again, thank you for that. I mean, again, it's a longer document, and I certainly cognizant of your time today. But I think those were the areas that I just either wanted to touch on, or individually past or current council have asked the questions. So I just think it's important that you understand this document, because it really does guide how you do business. So, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to actually pause then and sort of conclude the overview of the procedural bylaw. If there's any other questions, we'll answer those, and if not, we'll move to the next topic.
Are there any further questions on the procedural bylaw? Councillor Ashmore.
I just had a question for you to CAO. So as far as the definition of a quorum, that's greater than 50%. For example, if there's more than 5 members beyond that partition, then only 4 members can physically be here. I remember at one time there, clerk, I was going to sit over there. I said, well, that's 5. So you can't, I don't care where I sit, but I mean, or any other councillor as an observer. But so if you have 5, if you have greater than 50%, then you're deemed a council meeting anywhere, or is it just here? That was my question.
So I think in particular, this was, through you, Mr. Mayor, particular was the task force. So the task force had been established. It was 4 members of council. You wanted to come in, was it ATV or short-term rentals?
Yeah, that's what it was.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what it was. But I mean, if it's a meeting generally, say if you're meeting somewhere at any other location, so like you hear different definitions of it, but is it greater than 50%, and what location? Does that mean any location? That if there are 5 councillors or 5 members of council, it could be the mayor and or councillors put together, then it's not a
correct.
It's not a sanctioned meeting, put it that way.
So
just a question, that's all.
In order for it to be a council meeting, it would have to be an agenda. There would have to be a posted location. There'd be a chair. There'd be either a recording secretary or a clerk. So if there's a meeting set up and there's 4 councillors sitting on it, and you want to observe, that would be 5, but that still wouldn't constitute a council meeting. It would still be a meeting and open to the public.
But if you were at a public forum and you were helping a group of individuals, and there was 5 of us, and you're there for the good of the public, and then you feel like you're illegally there. If you're 5 of you out of 9 are there, is that still the case? It almost makes you feel guilty if you're helping somebody in a group.
So I think back in the day, after a council meeting, the council would go to Tim Hortons and have a coffee, and they'd do business. That's why the whole legislation was established. So what we want to do is to ensure open and transparent. So if you're at a social event like the Dream Ball, and we have a table of councillors, that does not constitute a meeting. Certainly if you go to the Chamber of Commerce luncheon and you have a councillor table set up and there's more than 5 there, that does not constitute a meeting.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, it's almost to the point where it's not trivial, but I mean, it's you want to support something, and then you have a group, and then you're almost like it's almost like insinuating that you're having a council meeting, but you're not. You're helping a group of taxpayers or residents, and you should be encouraged to be in a group. So
as long as you're not moving business forward, that's the key. if you're not moving business forward. Otherwise, you would have to conduct a council meeting per se, or a formal meeting per se.
No, I'm fine.
So you can still go out and have a drink afterwards, you just can't talk business, is pretty much, I guess, the order of the day. But I was gonna ask strategic planning, so if you went outside the municipality to do that, or I guess just around that, you're still allowed to have meetings where I guess you're forwarding business, especially in a strategic planning session. So how would that work? I know you kind of explained it the other day, but would be.
So through the mayor, so a couple of things. So first of all, again, the key, and I'm glad the clerk said it, we need to reiterate it. You can't advance the business of the city in that interaction with a quorum, which is 50+1. Whether it's council as a decision maker, but even if you had a committee that was then making recommendations, same applies. It can't be advancing their work, and it can't be a quorum of people. And before I answer the second question, I want to give maybe an opposing example, because it was this term of council, there was a community group that had asked for a meeting with council members, put out an invitation to all of council, but they had an agenda. It was at making a request ultimately, and the advice that was given was that would constitute a meeting if 5 or more council members attended, because it ultimately would be advancing that business, because they were asking you to make a decision ultimately. They were requesting for all the right reasons, and so the response was, I believe, 4 council members, more of sort of topical interest, attended that particular meeting. But so that's maybe another example, because you're going to get asked all the time, to Councillor Ashmore's point, to support the community, to be at certain, if you're at an event, casual event, should be there. But if you're going to a community group meeting and they've got an agenda saying, I want council to consider this decision, that does move ahead the collective business. So hopefully that helps just as an alternative if you're being asked. In terms of Councillor Warren's question, so the Municipal Act actually changed too. We're going to talk a little bit about what you can do in a closed session, open session, what constitute meetings. You can do sort of training and development and education. Some of these can still constitute a meeting, but how you have them, you still have to sort of minute it, note it, and so on, but you can have those meetings. So we could do a training session today, for example, and you can do it in a more closed format, if I could say it that way. There's just no need to do it that way. So similarly with strategic planning, great example. I'll say the last few iterations, so we've done them in town or in the city. We haven't necessarily done them locally like here at Chambers. We've made them open to the public. The public's been allowed to sit and listen in, kind of like the task force that I described sort of previously. So there's not an expectation or an interaction if it's not on the agenda from the public. So it's just council doing their work or business. So you can do that. If you were to do it external, sort of outside of the community, so it's not practically accessible, again, it would need to fall under one of those exceptions. So it would essentially be a training education type event, and it would have to meet those tests. So hopefully that helps.
So the test would be open and people could come to that meeting, even if it was outside. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that covers the procedural bylaw. So maybe we'll just keep to if we go to the next slide, sort of as really our agenda, if you will, turn it over and we'll talk about closed session meetings.
So this discussion was a good segue into the next topic, which is closed session meetings. So what the Municipal Act, Section 239 talks about is open meetings, that all meetings are to be open to the public But there is a list of exemptions, and so every time there is a closed session report that goes to closed session, you'll notice on the report, it'll state what section of the Municipal Act it actually qualifies under, whether it's a personnel matter, etc. So it could be a security of property, a personnel matter about an identifiable individual, proposed or pending acquisition or disposition of land, labor relations, litigation, advice subject to solicitor-client privilege, a request under MFIPA, which is Municipal Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act, and an ongoing investigation by the Ombudsman. And the Ombudsman, that organization is the one that will review your closed session. So if there's a complaint that we've gone into closed session and didn't qualify, someone could actually write to the Ombudsman and complain that we weren't holding an open meeting. And as Ron mentioned, education or training sessions, provided no member discusses or otherwise deals with any matter in a way that materially advances the business or decision-making of council. This will also include local boards. And so we look at closed session meetings continued. The definition of a meeting means any regular, special, or other meeting of council, of a local board, or of a committee of either of them, where a quorum of 5 members is present, and discuss or otherwise deal with any matter in a way that material advances the business or decision-making of the council, local board, or committee. So I think that is right out of the Act, and that's very clear on holding open meetings. It applies to all council, local boards, and committees of council, including working groups and task forces. And the conversation between members of council with a quorum privy to the conversation qualifies as a closed meeting session. Confidentiality is to be maintained for current and former council members. That means if the next term of council you decide not to run and you've been privy to confidential information during your term, you can't speak about that, even when you're no longer a council member. That also includes any documents that you retain, including notes. So all of that should be returned to the city, or at the least not shared with anybody. So it's really hard. I would either shred it or return it to the city. Contravention and complaints, of course, are Ontario Ombudsman. The Ontario Ombudsman would review and investigate the allegation, and then there would be a formal letter to the council saying, yes, you actually held a meeting that should have been open to the public, and what are you going to do in future to avoid that kind of situation happening again? Even though it's really hard to read because it's very small, the Ombudsman's office did provide a open meetings booklet, which is very helpful, very informative. Yes, you need, yeah, my arms aren't long enough, but anyways, this is a good reference book. Is there any questions about closed and open meetings?
Deputy Mayor Richardson.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. Am I also, just a clarification too, we're not to make notes during a closed session, right? When we're sitting and listening, we're not to be making notes.
Normally, no, you would not be making notes. However, sometimes if you have a question, some councils like to write down their question, so it's not forgotten until it's time that you can certainly ask questions regarding a report, but note taking is not ideal. Okay. And
So again, if there's not any other questions on that, just reiterate one item is actually, this little handy book is fantastic, and even some of the questions that you asked in the previous section, Council, you asked about quorum, you asked about, there's even examples about when it constitutes a training session or a closed meeting versus an open public meeting. I know it's online as well, so you can blow it up there if you needed to, but this is actually a fantastic guide that really focuses on the key pieces of how you would do business with examples. If I didn't see, does anybody else have any other questions then about closed meetings or open meetings for anybody? Okay. Then let's move on to the next slide or next topic, which is conflict of interest. And I'm going to turn it over to City Solicitor to touch on that topic. Or you're going to do that? Go ahead.
What,
So under conflict of interest, there actually is a Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. So it's a separate act that governs members as for indirect and direct pecuniary interest. And what I thought I would do is more of a Councillor Perry, your perfect timing, Q&A. So it's like an open book test. So I thought it's pretty dry, the Conflict of Interest Act, so I thought we'd go through a question and answer. So what is the purpose of the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? And the purpose of the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act is to prevent members from influencing the consideration of a matter in which they have a direct or indirect pecuniary interest. So what happens when a member has a conflict of interest? When a member has a conflict, they are expected to disclose the interest and the general nature of the intent before the matter is considered at a meeting, and not to participate in discussion or vote on the matter, not attempt to influence the voting on the matter before, during, after the meeting. So in our procedural bylaw, you'll notice that if someone has a conflict of interest, our procedural bylaw says that they will vacate the council chambers until the matter has been voted on, because sometimes even the presence of a person, the look they may be giving or whatever, could influence. So, yeah. So if you're getting the stink eye from someone, you know. So, and same as closed session. So if there's a pecuniary interest, to leave the closed session until the matter has been voted on. Who can file a complaint? An eligible elector or a person acting in the public interest who believes a member has contravened the conflict of interest rules in the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act may apply to the Integrity Commissioner to request an investigation within 6 weeks of becoming aware of a conflict of interest. So it may not be 6 weeks from the meeting where the councillor participated in the conversation and vote. It's 6 weeks of when they become aware. Can an anonymous complaint be filed? No. So no anonymous complaints will be accepted by the Integrity Commissioner. So how does a person make a complaint? Complaints may be submitted using the request for investigation form. We also have that on our website under accountability and transparency. Complaints will be required setting out the information in support of the allegations. Is there a fee to file a complaint? No, there's no cost. Are there any restrictions on when complaints can be submitted? It must be submitted 6 weeks of becoming aware of the conflict of interest. And also, there's a restriction during a municipal election. The Integrity Commissioner cannot accept applications between nomination day and voting day. If an individual becomes aware of a conflict of interest between nomination day and voting day, they must apply to the Integrity Commissioner 6 weeks after voting day. Will the Integrity Commissioner always launch a full investigation for every complaint received? Not necessarily. The Integrity Commissioner will review all applications and conduct investigations as he or she deems necessary. How long will it take for the Integrity Commissioner to complete an investigation? It depends. It has to be done within 180 days. Is there any reason why the Integrity Commissioner would not be able to complete an investigation? If he's not completed before nomination day, he would suspend the investigation. And what happens if the Integrity Commissioner believes a member has contravened the Municipal of Interest Act? Was that me? If after completing an investigation, the Integrity Commissioner believes it is appropriate, he or she may apply to a judge for a determination as to whether the member has a conflict of interest and what penalties or disciplinary actions might be imposed. There are a few: a reprimand, suspension of remuneration up to 90 days, member seat declared vacant, disqualification from being a member for a period of time not exceeding 7 years, and where applicable, restitution of financial gain. This would be determined by a judge. And then how is the public informed? It be on our website, the decision. So the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act talks about pecuniary interest, and it gives the detail. So I would suggest that it's not a huge act, but I would suggest every council member read it over thoroughly, and then refer to that when you are thinking that maybe you have a conflict. Refer to the Municipal Elections or Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. Staff cannot advise you. We can't give you recommendations on whether you are or you aren't. Either you have to go to the Act, make your own decision, or consult your own solicitor to determine whether you have conflict.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You talk about pecuniary interest and conflict of interest. They are not exactly the same, are they? A pecuniary interest speaks to a financial interest, whereas conflict of interest could be that you sit on a board and something to do with that board comes to council for a decision that could help that organization along. To me, that would be a conflict of interest, but it's not a pecuniary interest because you're not gaining financially from it. But the organization on whose board you sit may gain from it.
And through you, Mr. Mayor, to Mr. Mayor. So maybe Robin can give more of an interpretation, but under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, I think conflict of interest, pecuniary interest, that's a good question. Robin, do you want to provide more of a clarity?
Certainly. So the Conflict of Interest Act is limited to pecuniary interests. Our code of conduct might be more broad, so I would need to refresh myself on that and see if there's anything more broad. If the board that you sit on would benefit financially, then the Conflict of Interest Act would indicate that you would not vote in this. If the board that you sit on would be advantaged, you would be biased. You would have a horse in the game, so you would likely want to, although you wouldn't, in my opinion, be in conflict of the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, it could be questioned whether or not you are acting as a councillor, or if you were conflicted not in a non-pecuniary way. So in that case, if the code of conduct states that you shall not act in a conflict of interest, which it probably is more broad than just pecuniary, it would be the code of conduct that you would be worried about. But in all cases, you'd be worried about the optics of it. So although you wouldn't have the statutory restriction, the optics of not being able to make a decision solely as a councillor would be engaged. So you may decide to step away from making the decision, even though you're not in breach of the code of conduct or the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act.
Thank you. Councillor Ward?
Through you, and just to let everybody know, it's not just gain, it's also loss. So if you have a pecuniary interest, and it's not just gain, you could, if you are going to lose something also in a pecuniary way.
Yeah. I'm fine.
Okay, moving on.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So we'll go to the next slide. And we'll talk
Okay,
about,
so, and then that's me.
yep, I'll turn it over to Robin Carlson to talk about civil liability and limitations.
Okay, yes. And this may be the only real good news story when I'm flipping through the rest of the charts here. Most of the slides are about what you can't do, what you shouldn't do, this is a slightly different. It's just almost like a comfort slide, if you will, because I'm sure in the short tenure you've been with us, for those new members, you've realized how litigious the community can be. So you may be concerned that if you vote in a certain way, when you are conducting your job as a councillor, whether or not you can attract personal liability. So the Municipal Act actually sets out an exemption for individuals being sued by members of the public for acting in the course of their duties. So if you're acting as a member of council, voting on something, if the decision of council was such that it was non-favorable to a member of the public, any of those type of actions are good faith actions and garner protection under the Municipal Act, under Section 448 of the Municipal Act. The, of course, exemption is bad faith actions when you're acting on your own. The clerk indicated conflict of interest type scenarios, or I would suggest defamation. You're acting outside of council, you're acting outside of council-sponsored messaging, and you're making defamatory statements or anything of that nature. So there are exemptions, but I am sure that that is not a concern for you, and you will all be acting in good faith when and if a claim comes against you. When statements of claim are served against you, they need to be served against you personally. So you might have someone knock on your door and serve you an action that says it's against the city of Kawartha Lakes and it's against you. And in that case, you call me up and we take a look at the provisions that we have in the indemnification bylaw, which is the city's indemnification bylaw, which mirrors the protection in Section 448. So again, if you're acting in good faith, just doing your job, and as a result of that, you've been sued. I've never seen a case where just the individual is sued. It's usually the individual, maybe some members of staff, and the city. Those are the actions of the city, and the individual should be removed. What we do is we confirm that the indemnification bylaw is responsive, meaning the city will provide legal defense, will act in your behalf and on behalf of the city. You are entitled to your own representation under the indemnification bylaw, but most people choose to have one legal counsel act for both, and then that individual in a preliminary attendance attempts to hive off the individual from the claim. They would bring a motion and say, please remove Councillor X and just proceed against the city. You might see that the statements of claim are set out so they allege bad faith against the individual. So again, it's a nod to the fact that they're understanding that Section 448 limits them from bringing individual claims. And if that's the case, we say, fine, we won't proceed with the motion, we'll continue to trial, but the city deals with it by saying on the back end, we'll continue to defend, cover all the costs, and if there is some bad faith, then of course there will be, we'll need to deal with that. But it's usually just a spurious bad faith matter. If there's any indication of bad faith, then we would hire two separate legal counsels and then deal with the accounting at the back end. But I don't think that will be the case. It's just usually a strategic issue. So again, I can't provide legal advice to individual counselors, but this is being provided to you as members of council and for your information. So that's about it. So you should feel confident when you proceed to carry out your business. And if you have any questions, I'll answer them now.
I'm not seeing any, so thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
So we'll go to the next sort of topic, and we'll just make sure it's switched. So page 4. Which policy we were referencing, you mean, in the policy binder? Well, we're going to talk generally about, we're going to get to the code of conduct next. So it was in the council agenda package. I think it is in your, yes, it would be tab number 2. There'll be a little bit of preamble or introductory, but so I want to talk generally about sort of delivery of services. Again, I'll just go back to when we talked about the procedure in the procedural bylaw. It says very clearly what are the roles and responsibilities of the clerk, of the CAO, of the administration, and then by extension, individual council members, council as a body, and the chair or the mayor. And so I do think those are important. We always are defaulting back to those core roles and responsibilities, and they're reflective in all of the policies that you then establish or update. But essentially, council works through me, I'll say, as the position, and our other leaders to define certain program deliverables. So you establish sort of service levels, we implement. And we talked previously about the other roles where you're a decision maker, and then the administration is the implementer of those decisions. And it's, again, delivered through the entire administration. So I'm saying that quite broadly because there are so many services that we manage. And then my additional sort of role is to provide oversight to the administration and also serve as a liaison in between council. So this is really just some preamble to talk about now interactions, council-employee relations, how we do work and accomplish work. And again, the other thing I'll remind you is when we were talking about procedure, again, it needs to be a council decision as a body. So council can direct work, council can direct service levels, individuals cannot. So I think that's important, because that's why we set up a lot of these, or you set up or confirm a lot of these processes to bring things into the public realm and to your council meetings to make those decisions and then direct that work be done. And there's an expectation that it is going to get delivered within the parameters and the consistencies that you've set. So I'm going to turn it over to Leanna just to touch on, we went through this document sort of at length. I do want to revisit or focus on a couple of specific areas, but the next slide really speaks to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, obligations, and maybe some of the questions that have come up in past terms of council about those interactions with employees and what guides you in those. So I'll turn it over to you, Leanna.
Thank you. Good afternoon, through you, Mr. Mayor. I was thinking this morning when I was reviewing my notes that maybe I'll try to draw a bit of a visual for you, and we're going to use circles, and we have 2 circles. And so as council members, the 9 of you are in a circle, and you're in a circle unto yourselves. You're the only elected officials, and as they've been talking about today, is you make one decision. Your overarching guidance is the Municipal Act generally. We've heard, the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, but basically you have this umbrella over top of your circle, and you have to stay within your scope. The rest of us, Ron, through to directors, myself, we're in an employment relationship. So we're in another circle. Now those circles intersect, for sure. They intersect all the time. There's no volunteers in our circle. There's no contractors in our circle. I'm just speaking of the people who are truly in the employment relationship. So we have completely different legislation overarching all that we do or can do or must do. So of course we have the Occupational Health Safety Act and we have the Employment Standards Act. We've entered into agreements for collective agreements and those sorts of things. So as Ron's saying, ideally, if you have a concern out of a service outcome, you have to kick it over to the employment relationship somehow so that we can follow through and find out why that service maybe wasn't, or the outcome wasn't as you expected it to be. And so that should really come to the CIO or to that director. If you observe something, say, from a public works worker, ideally you wouldn't walk up to the worker, you would call up Brian and say, hey, I saw X and Y today, do you think that was right? Or whatever your question is about that service. So ideally, if we each stay in our circles, directors, staff won't come into your circle and you won't come into ours, but we have to know where they intersect, that's all. Does that help a little bit to create that visual?
Councillor Ashmore.
Just through the mayor to Leanna. So are you recommending, say, if you have a question, either the director first and then the CAO if you have a question? So you had mentioned that, if you had a question, talk to the director. Would that be correct?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. I think, I didn't review that with Ron in advance, but I think that would be your best option rather than going directly to a staff person, because of course then they feel confused when a single council member asks them a question and perhaps you're saying, you suggest, shouldn't the outcome be X? And they're like, well, I thought the outcome was Y. So it's confusing to the staff person and it might set them down a different path and it might look like you're acting independently when maybe you were just asking a question.
Maybe, Mr. Mayor, I do want to confirm it, because we are going to, in subsequent, sort of talk about information exchange and items like that. And so I'm glad that we're sort of talking about it here. It's when you have a service concern, we're talking about it under that context. General questions, general inquiries are separate and distinct, but if you have a service concern, it, to Leanna's point, sort of needs to be managed within the employer-employee sort of relationship, and it needs to be done in the context of the direction that the administration was collectively provided, which means a decision that you made, we're implementing, If you aren't comfortable that it's being implemented within that framework or those other established processes, that's where council members should approach a director or approach me and ask the questions. Because it's a performance, it's meeting a service level inquiry. But if it's to sort of express a general, you could do that better, or you really should be over there, or whatever it may be, again, that's where we want to make sure that the relationship between council and between the employer is very clear. The administration needs to direct staff, and then there's accountabilities that are built in. And it just don't want council to get in those circumstances where they're directing work that maybe is otherwise different from what's established by policy or established by you through a particular decision as a body. So hopefully that helps distinguish it a little bit. I wouldn't suggest that every question that you have about everything in the city that you go to a director or go to me. There are other sort of built-in sort of ways to get that general information, if you will.
So if a member of council wants to meet with a staff person, whether they be, doesn't matter what position they're in, is that a no-no or is that okay? Because there's either yes or no. I hate to put it on the spot, but so you cannot, so all site visits with any employee are off. You cannot meet any employee in the city. So that's what you're saying, period.
That's what I'm saying. But I'm saying that with the caveat that, again, we understand that there are circumstances. We would arrange that, or we would want to talk through. You need to talk to a director. You need to talk to me in terms of maybe where that line is. But if you're going out in site visits, technically you're talking with an individual potentially advancing business, and you're not speaking for council, nor are you necessarily speaking for the employer. And so that's where we get a lot of confusion sort of in the field, where you're approaching individuals. They don't have all of the information. They're only sort of dealing with sort of what task they're set out to do.
Okay, so you can't go to a Works Depot somewhere, anywhere in the city, and go and say, you're doing a great job, and I'd like to meet you, say hello, and just familiarize yourself with those employees. That's a no-no then? You can't interact with your employees? Like, I mean, just something like that people would maybe appreciate, or it's really important, I think. But I mean, I know I don't mean to put it on the spot, but I mean, I think it's a valid question that.
Yeah, what I'd say, currently, I am going to every fire hall and meeting with the firefighters. But I went through Chief Jones, and he and his deputy chief arranged for me to do this, and they accompany me. And I would say if you wanted to go to a Works Depot, you would go through the director, and he would make the appropriate arrangements for you to be able to go there, and he may accompany you, or he may have one of his managers accompany you. But it's certainly possible to do, and nobody's saying we can't talk to individual employees in a social context or in a friendly, hey, how are you today, kind of greeting. That's not what's being said. What's being said is we can't approach individual employees about the work they're doing. That, I would say, is a no-no.
No, I wasn't referring to that, and I appreciate the answer. What I was saying is that if there was, say, for example, a case file that's been registered and it's an ongoing task that's being done, and you would like to, say, meet a supervisor or a manager, just for example, snow plowing in Victoria Place, just as an example, like just for a few minutes, that's something like that, just as an example. That's breaking the rules, basically?
I would say that you could go through the council EA with a copy to the director, and possibly the manager who has that area, and let them come back to you with what the status of that case is.
I will clarify, at a future session, we do want to talk about cases, we want to talk about complaint management, we'll talk about customer service more broadly. I mean, you're asking a number of questions, good questions that, quite frankly, it's a lot of gray area for the administration as well. But I think leaving today, I think when in doubt, have a conversation with the director or myself, because we're finding that more often than not, that interaction is being interpreted as asking for a different work outcome or some service that's directing work. And so we don't want to get into those particular positions. Having said that, again, and to the mayor's point, this is not to stop interaction with people. We want to make sure that we understand and we want to talk. But we also don't want all the parties in a circumstance where, again, it's directing or changing work that is otherwise assigned. So hopefully that helps. But we're going to talk later about future education sessions. And one is talking about cases and how we interact on those particular items. Sorry, go ahead, Deputy Mayor.
Yes, sorry, thank you. Okay, I just have a quick question, just for clarification. So if we're to reach out to a staff member through an email, just sometimes a question will be asked by a resident and you're looking for a better understanding before you respond to that resident, so you're providing a more fulsome, response back. Should we be, when that question is put forward, to say, you have a field worker that's, knows that or is in that area and understands it, but should we be like putting the director, the manager, and then that person on the email chain to be a little bit more transparent? Is that what you're looking for?
That's certainly what I would do.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. And so then when we turn our minds to the employer's obligation, so those of us in the employment circle, we have obligations under the Occupational and Safety Act. And we are the supervisors under that act. So of course, every organization who falls under this act has to denote competent people who know the business, knows the activities, and take proactive measures to keep employees safe. And that's easy to think of in the physical sense. Of course, you measure a hazard and you put PPE in place or processes in place. But some behaviors such as harassment can also cause harm to a worker. That's why it falls under the Occupational Safety Act. So if that harm was to come from a counselor, even an allegation, then the employer's duty still kicks in and we have to apply the act. And the act requires us to know what happened. We have to receive that complaint. We might receive it on the form of an accident incident. We use a reporting process for accident incident complaints or harm, and we follow it through. Whether it's a physical accident or an emotional accident, we want to understand what happened, because we have a responsibility to put protection in place to mitigate a hazard, either eliminate the hazard, reduce the hazard. So in the event that we were to receive an allegation of harassment from an employee against a counselor, we would receive that in People Services. My team would do the intake for that, which would be a meeting with the employee, help us understand what happened, are there facts, to back up that allegation. And if we felt that it was necessary to complete an investigation, we would hire a neutral external third party. We wouldn't do that internally. And we would hope that the council member would participate in the conversation. And again, it's to understand what happened and what can we do to ensure any accident doesn't reoccur. That's really our obligation under the Act. So I share that with you. That's what you could expect to happen if an allegation was to come forward. Any questions about that?
Okay, thank you for that. And it's a perfect segue into sort of the next section. I talked about the code of conduct. We've talked about it previously and we've walked through it. It's tab 2 in your policy binder, and it was also in the agenda for today. There is language within that code of conduct directing or reinforcing, I'll say, these behaviors of, council members, because again, this is your code of conduct. So it is essentially sort of providing some guidance in terms of when you get into employee and council relations, how you would interact and mix with staff. I'm going to talk after this slide about Bill 5 and maybe where things are heading. But Leanna was spot on that the current code of conduct and the current health and safety and policies in place, that's how we would proceed with an investigation under the Health and Safety Act. The code of conduct, though, sets out those clear expectations for all of you, for all of members, and it's expected that you'll follow the principles of that code. I should have mentioned that there are 3 codes of conduct that are established in the city. One is specifically for you. One is specifically for all employees. And then there's a third one that we created that's a little more focused for board members, committee members. Traditionally, those were guided by your code of conduct. But as you can appreciate, the nuances and the way that they do business is different, but in some outcomes similar. And so we wanted to make sure that all onboarded volunteers had an understanding of expectations of their conduct as well. So let's go right to the next slide, because I know we've reviewed that code of conduct a couple times. And I want to talk about Bill 5 briefly. You should have a copy, I believe, of the bill in its sort of draft form. It's had first reading provincially, but it's timely and topical based on what Leanna just introduced. And the clerk previously talked about the Integrity Commissioner and the powers under the Integrity Commissioner to deal with a municipal conflict of interest. And in those outcomes, they have an ability to refer those issues to a court for a judge to make a determination at the direction of council. Essentially, Bill 5 is proposing the same thing, but under the code of conduct. So the IC, you're required to have an Integrity Commissioner appointed. That's provincial. And they essentially have 2 streams that they work under: municipal conflict of interest and compliance with the code of conduct and policies that you have approved that govern your conduct and behaviors. So essentially, Bill 5 is saying where there are circumstances of violence and harassment and allegations, similar to the example that Leanna outlined. Currently, it's either investigated internally as the employer under the Health and Safety Act, or, sorry, I should say not or, the IC would receive complaints from the public or employees with respect to breaches in code of conduct, but the language is not clear currently for the powers of the IC to weigh in on violence and harassment. And so the bill is essentially proposing that above and beyond what currently occurs, they can review harassment and violence as well and make additional recommendations through council that ultimately could be, because of the scope and severity of them, if you will, can go beyond what the current penalties are that an IC could recommend for a breach of a code of conduct. So it's essentially now saying in those circumstances, those could also be referred to an externality and a judge to make a determination. So that's kind of the summary of that Bill 5. It doesn't have any status currently. If it is approved at the provincial level, it would update the Municipal Act, and by extension, we would then come back to you with directed updates to the code of conduct, which would empower those outcomes to potentially occur.
Got a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
Deputy Mayor Richardson?
Thank you, and through you, and actually, you pretty much answered my last, my thought with the last two statements, is it is an amendment to the Municipal Act, and in essence, it's giving, it's creating a process, right? So if you have a municipal councillor that breaks breaks those rules that are policy set out for workplace and harassment, then you have more options to have them removed from council. Is that basically, and I've also, did some background research and noticed that there's a lot of municipalities that are actually, moving towards putting this on the table as a policy, a sitting policy with their councils. Just didn't know if you wanted to provide any more information.
I think, well, you're spot on up to date. I would suggest that you can't incorporate some of those outcomes until the legislation changes. So you would not be empowered until the Municipal Act is changed to refer certain matters externally to a judge. It needs to be provincially enacted to empower you to do that. I will say that our code of conduct is quite good and updated in terms of meeting or exceeding current Municipal Act legislation as it relates to conduct, to violence and harassment in the workplace generally. So it does address it. Most other codes of conduct don't even address it because it's not required in the Municipal Act. So you do address it generally, but the penalties and outcomes are what are being sort of debated, if you will, at the provincial level.
Right, so we're, it's, like you said, it's already, it's creating that process, right? So we have to just wait until if it passes to the provincial, and then changes will be made in accordance to those changes. Okay, thanks.
Councillor McDonald?
Yeah, thank you, through you. The code of conduct for volunteers, we have lots and lots of volunteers, and what's our procedure to, with our volunteers to bring them in and do that coaching and counseling? Do they sign off a code of conduct if they're going to volunteer for the city? You have a code of conduct for volunteers, but do the volunteers know that? And how do we reach out to the volunteers to get them more trained of what their code of conduct is?
Great question. Thank you for that, because it's good to highlight it. So in the last term of council, at the beginning of the last term of council is when we established or separated those codes. And it was for almost that reason. It was that sort of broader understanding, and it felt like it was buried within a broader sort of council-facing or one single-facing code of conduct. So we split them out. When we do the advertising and so advertising first and onboarding, we let them know that they are guided by certain council policies. And so those are identified. Those are provided publicly. They're on the city's website for access. And we actually tell them that that's the case. This is the second term of council where at an initial meeting of any committee or board, we also have an orientation session. And department liaisons are required to advise all the volunteers of those respective committees of what is the expectation. So I'm sure all of you have gone through, here's your terms of reference, is the key document for any committee. In that document, it outlines you're also subject to this code of conduct or these other policies. And it's expected that the departments will walk through those different documents each term of council. So we don't even take it for granted. In fact, not only just each term of council, but in some cases there's a mid-term where you onboard new volunteers. So they have a 2-year time frame. We've written into the terms that we also, any new members need that same orientation oncoming. So I'll say we're getting better every cycle. There's a lot of information that volunteers get inundated with, but honestly, it's important because we're finding more and more that the public is stating that expectation on those individual volunteers. And so we want to make sure that they're fully supported and fully understand what's expected of them.
So Sarah is heavily involved with the volunteer recruitment, and she just advised me that all volunteers for committees and boards and advisory receive an orientation package. So they physically receive their code of conduct and the documents that are related to their position.
Councillor Ashmore.
Thank you. Through you to CAO. With regards to Bill 5, as far as the process, right now, if there's workplace violence and harassment, which is a very serious thing, are the police not asked to investigate? So basically what the power of the Integrity Commissioner proposes is that they take over the role of the police and bypasses that. So there's no, like, this is what I'm just getting an answer, I'm just trying to understand. If there's violence and harassment, which is a very serious thing, why isn't the police involved first to investigate?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So I'll say in some circumstances where it offends the criminal legislation or whatever, it's automatically referred to the police. But harassment isn't always a criminal, what's the term I'm looking for? Anyways, sorry? Yeah, so it's not an offense under the criminal code. Not always. And so in those circumstances, very often ICs are getting complaints that individual members have harassed the public, or harassed is really the easier example. That's why I'm sticking to that. And so there's no set of tests other than the deferral right now is to the code of conduct. If it's an employee, the deferred is to the Health and Safety Act as the employer. So essentially what this legislation is proposing is to fill the gap. The IC, I just want to be very clear on this too, they do a report, they work on your behalf and provide recommendations to you on sort of breaches and on penalties, and it's all prescribed in the Act. As I read Bill 5, I understand that that doesn't change. So the Integrity Commissioner will expand their investigation, but ultimately council needs to direct that it be referred to that third party. So that's at least how I'm reading the legislation currently. So they are not the judge and jury and the police. That's not the case. It's just expanding on their scope of investigative work and the recommendations that come through to council.
Thank you. I have a question about the current situation. So if an employee is being harassed and there are really, other than maybe embarrassment or, a slap on the wrist to, if it was a counselor, saying don't do that again, could an employee sue a counselor for harassment? And if that was the case, how would that go under the civil liability and limitations for counsel? Would there be because you'd have a corporation that was conflicted because it would be representing both parties. Is that a real possibility, or is that not a possibility?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. So you have an individual who has a civil suit. The civil suit is, again, separate from criminal. It is, I've suffered some damages, personal damages that aren't covered by the criminal lawsuit. and so I'm seeking recovery against the individual. The individual counselor would be, assuming the person is actually convicted of harassment or is found by the IC to have been guilty of harassment, such that that becomes like a Bill 5 matter that's referred to the courts. Then yes, it is the case that it could be that there's some exposure there, and that the city's indemnification bylaw would not cover the counselor, because the counselor wouldn't be acting in the good faith execution of their job.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So let's go to the next slide, and really the conclusionary sort of part of the conversation, where we want to talk about just general administration. I think this is also a good touch-in after a little more than 6 months. It's hard to believe that that's already occurred for this new term of council. But again, it's meant to be sort of that you have what you need, that you have an understanding of sort of what are those sort of guiding policies, all of those different guiding documents, and then that you have the resources to do your job properly. So we're going to touch on a couple of items, but the first one is just rounding back then to policies. Again, you have your binders. So that was intended to capture all of the council-facing policies that govern your work. There's been some recent changes to a couple. I'll turn it over to Kathy just to touch on where we're going.
So council adopted a policy governing policies. And one of the requirements is that council reviews every term of council their policies. So we reduced amount of policies in the last term of council. I can't remember the number. It was over 200 down to 180 or 120. Anyways, so those policies that were either redundant or replaced with something else and were no longer required. But council does have an obligation to review all policies. We started off with a policy binder for council members, just for ease of reference, that our policies directly that govern council. So in your binder, we've already talked about the procedure bylaw, code of conduct, accountability and transparency, access information and privacy policy. Now, maybe sometime in the fall, we're going to have a session on protecting privacy and records, emails, and other documents that are under the control of council. Confidentiality of information policy, obligations of confidentiality, elected officials record and correspondence policy, council expense policy, council computer system policy, and the recruitment policy. And as we mentioned in tab 10, Bill 5. So, of course, we've asked you to replace the index with the one that Sarah has provided, replace council expense policy under tab 7, add council computer policy to tab 8, and add recruitment policy to tab 9. So this is an ongoing process, and any policies that we come across that we think would be of benefit, we'll make sure that we update the material for your binders. In the what we're hoping for in the future is to have on SharePoint a counselor site that the counselor can go into and know that they can get the documents that they need, that they will reference on a regular basis instead of having open up to the whole SharePoint site. So we are going to be working on that in the next while. The other thing would be the material for closed sessions. We're also looking at SharePoint, And there's the site for closed electronic files instead of the orange paper, and trying to get the report circulated before the closed session, either picking up or currying. And we felt that it would be a time limited where those closed session documents would be up on the website, password protected. You'd be able to read it, can't print it, save it, share it, but you can certainly read it up until the closed session, and then it will be taken down. So that's, I think, my update on policies.
So if I could, I'll just supplement very briefly, and it's on the slide. So the first two bullets, you've already seen those policies. They came through this term of council. They were updates. That's why they're in your binder. The third bullet, the recruitment policy, we actually didn't get to at our last session, but I did want to flag it to you because there was some changes from previous terms of council. And we didn't have an opportunity up until today to highlight it. So essentially the recruitment policy outlines how we onboard employees.
Councillor McDonald, you had a question?
Yeah, I'll wait till you finish the recruitment part, and my question will be there.
Sorry about that. So in the recruitment policy, and it does have an employee sort of facing requirement, but as we were updating, it's essentially that nepotism sort of policy that is ongoing, and we've tightened up or put much clearer language in terms of onboarding employees and familial relations with those employees onboarded. So essentially what this is highlighting is that in the last term of council added themselves as during your term of council, as you're an active councillor, that employees cannot have a familial relationship with you onboarding. Obviously, if they are already here and then you're elected subsequently, we're obviously going to respect that contractual arrangement or agreement. But the idea was that during your term of council, if we're onboarding new employees, they can't be family members of yourselves. That applies to my position as well, citywide. And then we've also drilled down in that policy where there's oversight or decision makers. You can't have family members in those respective work areas either. So a director couldn't have a family member in their department, for example, for simplicity. And again, it's really, we've come across a number of sort of nepotism issues in the last few terms of council. And so that's why the rationale is there, just to be clear moving forward.
Councillor McDonald.
Yes, through you, thank you. Yeah, that was my question with the recruitment policy for council and family members. And my next question is the recruitment policy for staff, which I think you said that staff has the same policy. So I think with not that I have any family member or anything like that, but anybody at council, it just seems to be a funny policy that we're looking for so many people to work anymore, and then all of a sudden Lindsay's a pretty small town, and if you're a big family, you're related to a lot of people. And it just seems to be a little kind of hard to kind of accept when we're looking for so much staff, and just because they might be related to one of these people sitting on this table here, that they wouldn't be considered. Just that was a comment too, I guess, but.
No, and through you, Mr. Mayor, and I appreciate it. And the last term of council and internally, we sort of grappled with it. But when you really look at sort of both sides, the optic of onboarding a family member, it's more recognized than maybe some of our recruitment challenges that are there. And maybe my second item, I really want to specify, it's not entirely through the city. So your decision makers are influencers. And so it was deemed appropriate to exclude during your timeframes as council members onboarding employees. it applies to me, just based on my position, sort of as head of the administration. It doesn't apply sort of right across the board. It applies then in departments. So the idea is that we don't want oversight to occur, or relationship oversights, but a family member of a director, I'll use as an example, in one department could be hired in a different department. They just can't be under that influence or oversight. So again, I appreciate what you're saying, and we're a big small town, I always say, and so sure, there are some limitations, but I think the risks outweigh the rewards, quite frankly, and it has been a good policy that I think has been well received, both publicly and by employees.
Councillor Joyce.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. With the immediate family definition there, it all makes sense until the last bit there. In-law familial relationships, how far does that go? Yeah, I respect that, my wife's brother or sister would be my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law, I get that, but what about nephews and nieces? That's pretty far away from me, if that should ever occur.
Through you to the councillor. The immediate definition is still there, mother, father, and so we're not expanding into niece, nephew. We're sticking with the terminology that's there, but if it's mother-in-law, father-in-law, brother-in-law, but it's not niece, nephew. So it's rather than listing all the various definitions of brother, we try to kind of sum it up at the end.
Okay, so what about my sister-in-law's husband? Where would he sit?
Through you, he's not on the list, so he's in.
Okay. It's not that it's going to happen. I don't see it happening. I just want to clarify, should this ever come up, where we sit. Thank you.
Anybody else? No? Okay.
Okay, let's go to the last slide, which is, again, just talking about administrative matters and really just more of a touch-in. So as I understand, you have a copy of some of the key dates upcoming for you beyond sort of the normal committee. So you already approved a calendar for council meetings, committee of the whole meetings, and planning committee meetings as sort of a baseline. You're very busy. And so we're trying to sort of balance agendas, trying to balance that ability, though, to make sure we have sessions like this so that you're well informed. And that's going to be ongoing. There is some future education that we still want to accomplish. But again, wanting to balance sort of your other obligations and just your availability and schedule. So for the balance of this year, this is the last orientation session that we're proposing to the end of Q2. We talked about the summer season. You do have 2 council meetings in the summer, one towards the end of July, one towards August. No committee of the whole meetings are scheduled, and we had already talked about, though, the ability to do some business at those 2 touch points. When we get into September, you're back to committee of the whole and council. You're on many committees, I'm sure, so there's also those committee meetings underlying. And I hate to say it, but we're already going to be starting our next budget process for 2024. And it's going to be a little bit more compressed. It's earlier, but essentially from mid-September to early mid-December, that entire program will be layered into your schedules. So what is handed out to you and will be providing as an update is those special council meetings that the chair's already approved to be able to run through that program. It won't waver much from what you've experienced already. It's just that it's at a different time period in the year. So aware of budget. The other is strategic planning. And there are also a couple of other information sessions that we would like to have before the end of this year. One I already mentioned, so I want to talk about customer service, case management, complaint management, and we will do that in a special council meeting education session similar to this sometime in the fall. The other is strategic planning. So there's a current active strategic plan for the city. I call it more, it's more of a community plan, quite frankly. It's established each term of council. It slightly overlaps your time frame, and it was deliberate so that we can get a refreshed set of priorities, fresh set of interests that's reflective of you and your current council and mandate. So the current plan expires or is timed to the end of this year. So what we would like to do in the latter half of this year is start that program and have sessions with you to develop that updated plan. The goal would be to bring that final plan in the first quarter of next year, earlier than later too, so probably January, maybe early February. So that means we're going to have a couple, probably two, possibly three, but really two. The others might be in a committee of the whole type setting, but two sessions where we need to have workshops. So I'm just putting this out there sort of as we've got 3 or 4 sort of sessions that we need to have outside of the calendar. And I kind of and I did want to touch base with you to sort of see how we accommodate your schedules. Right now, meetings are on Tuesdays. I'm hoping that is at least the most convenient, starting there. And if we can look at then good advance notice, how would you like to? So I'd like to get some feedback today on if we can accomplish these 3 or 4 additional items and how you would maybe like to see them roll out. So I'll pause there maybe just to get some feedback. But what we would be proposing is through the mayor and then through you, looking at maybe Tuesdays either outside of committee of the whole or council, and or if you really wanted to, we could schedule like a morning session on the day that you would have a committee of the whole or council in the afternoon, but recognizing that's a heavy ask of you for one day. So I'll leave it at that and maybe just get some feedback.
Councillor Ashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, to the CAO. Yeah, the Tuesdays work good for me personally. The committee of the whole, we found that they've been dragging on a bit long. Is there any way, my first question is there any way that we could maybe have presentations maybe limited to certain time periods? And the third thing was last term we started to go on the road. So we had a council meeting in Bobcaygeon, we had one in Little Britain, and we had one in Janetville, which was great. And do you think maybe we could start that again? I mean, not a lot of meetings outside of here, but perhaps we could carry that on again.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, so I've noted down sort of the Tuesdays. In terms of committee of the whole, again, I do acknowledge and appreciate that they've been hefty agendas, sort of certainly at the front end. I'd like to hope that over the term of your council, they're going to smooth out a little bit. But having said that, they are intended to take on more public interaction. They're meant to be more educational in nature or bring topics forward. So there's some deliberate scheduling of certain items to those meetings rather than a formal council meeting. And where we heard it mostly in the last terms of council, and I'm sure some returning will agree, it was the public that was suggesting that the committee of the whole was a positive venue for them, that it was a better, maybe a more casual venue, that council, more formal, was intimidating, they were on the clock, that kind of thing. And of course, we have to balance, obviously, efficiencies and so on. But to your point about limiting presentations, we try to limit presentations, and the mayor can confirm, to a sort of 10 to 15 minute time frame. I appreciate it's not working. It's not working not just because of the presenters, though. I would suggest it's how we're interacting in those presentations. And I'm saying that deliberately. The idea is that you as council at committee of the whole, more so than you're receiving information. And so what we're trying to balance is that interaction that you can have with a presenter, with a deputant, and so on, so that when you get to council, that's the decision-making time. That's when you take all of the information and then have more of a debate, a conversation with yourselves to have an outcome. Again, I'll preface it by saying early days, sure. There's been, if you put 3 or 4 presentations, you tell people it's 15 minutes, with questions and with conversation, they are extending to a half an hour. There's no question that you're overwhelmed and that those meetings are hefty. So going forward, I know the mayor, clerk, and myself, we've sort of talked about how we limit presentations, but you may hear that that also limits their ability to bring things forward to you. But we're going to do best efforts and sort of try to juggle that. And I think just simply reminding them of time frames so that you're not exhausted or overwhelmed at any given agenda. So I'll leave it at that. Go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. And I think also to the point that of having them off-site, I certainly would like to see some done off-site. It does create a problem in that now with openness and transparency, we're now televised, and we're on YouTube. To get the technology to some of the places we would go becomes very difficult. It's also somewhat onerous on staff. We want to attend the meetings, and if we have the meetings at night, it becomes even more onerous, not only on you to attend the evening meetings, which may take you away from other things, but also to get staff there, and then we have to accommodate staff to either have appropriate time off or compensate them in some way for the extra time they're working. So it is problematic, but I am a fan of going off-site, and perhaps we can do it in some other ways. We'll try and be creative, and we'll try and do it. So, Councillor Warren.
Yeah, through you. Just on strategic planning sessions, I think it should be like a day-long affair. It's kind of meaty, and I don't think it should be on the back of a committee of the whole meeting or a council meeting.
Councillor Joyce.
Thank you. Through you, for your feedback there, I really like this pattern of Tuesdays at 1 o'clock. I'm not in favor of adding something in the morning of those same days, but a lot of us have a side business, and today's a perfect example. If I'm looking ahead for a meeting, I make sure my Tuesday afternoons are wide open for anything that can pop up council-wise now. I like that lockstep. So that's my feedback.
I generally, when council days, I schedule nothing else. I don't do anything else because I don't know how long it's going to go, and it could be that I need to find stuff in the morning or talk to somebody or get feedback or whatever. So my way of handling it was I never scheduled anything for council day. Councillor Perry.
Yeah, if I could, just going back to the committee of the whole, because I think no one's suggesting that, well, I think we're all acknowledge, rather, the merit of a committee of the whole. It seems like an excellent structure, and it certainly does, in my opinion, streamline council meetings, which we all appreciate. I just think there are some really easy ways in terms of best practices that we would be able to achieve that balance better. No one's well served after 5 hours with the public or councillors. And so I would just wonder if there were perhaps an openness or where we could send a few suggestions on how to, tighten things up a bit. And that would be discipline not only for presenters, but also for councillors. Often meeting discipline is a learned behavior. It's a process, not an event, myself especially included. And so I'd definitely be encouraging, again, a few best practices from various sectors could help us here with our meetings of committee of the whole. Thank you.
Well, we're always open to, just send an email to all of council on any suggestions you have, and we'll share them and see what we can do.
Okay.
I can tell you that your meeting on June 6th, the committee of the whole, We are starting at 10 in the morning because we're going to deal with short-term rentals in the morning, and then we'll deal with committee of the whole. And it is, again, a fairly meaty agenda.
Sure, and I appreciate fundamentally, sometimes long meetings are necessary, absolutely. But whether it might be able to be avoided with, structural changes or some best practices, I think that's something we could definitely strive for.
We'd absolutely love to hear from you.
Great, thanks.
Deputy Mayor Richardson.
Thank you, and through you, I'm just going to comment right now that I find the structure that we have does work, because we're, getting all that information on Tuesdays. And again, I always, for the last 4.5 years, always knock off Tuesdays. I'm not doing anything but council. And yeah, there's been some long meetings, but we've had a lot to deal with in the first 6 months of this term of council. And I find that as we're going through the process, I feel like we are getting better. So we just need to keep doing what we're doing. And I think we're all learning to work together. So we're going to have some growing pains. And I think where we're going is a fine direction from my perspective.
Thank you. Councillor McDonald.
Yeah, through you, thank you. Yeah, I believe the Tuesdays for the committee of the whole is working. I think it's a great opportunity for the people to be able to speak their mind and do their deputations and receive them like we do. One point was too, though, is when we do have the committee of whole, sometimes decisions can be made at committee of whole, or they are made, and then I guess it goes to council. And I guess if there's no when you take them out exemptions or whatever, then they get passed anyway. So, but anyway, I think it's a good process, and sometimes the meetings go long, but guess what? That's what we're hired for. So.
That's right.
Councillor Warren.
So, I mean, the mayor and the CAO and whoever's doing the agenda can probably see that it's going to be a long agenda and that it's going to take more time as the 6th. So from your point of view, if you see that, maybe we need to have a start once in a while at 10 to facilitate that, so you're not going the other end when people are getting really tired and not making good decisions.
Thank you. And I will say that we're starting at 10 on June the 6th, but I'm planning on you being finished by 12 or before, and we'll reconvene at 1. We weren't planning on bringing in lunch or anything. So I think it's doable, because we're going to deal solely with Manager Sloan's report. We have some deputations, but most of the deputations that we'll be getting will probably be 2.5 minutes, and we're limiting it to 16 deputations. So, it should be quite manageable. Well, and I know the task force has done a fabulous job, and we'll get through it in jig time. Thanks.
All right, thank you, through the mayor. So I think we've got some good feedback that we'll be able to take back and start scheduling for the fall, and we'll get ahead of it so that you know well in advance what would be expected sort of in those other Tuesdays then, starting in September. I probably should have touched, the only other item on this is I mentioned there's 2 meetings in the summer only. There's planning committee, but then there's only 2 council meetings, one in July, one in August. If we needed to call, or if the mayor needed to call a special council meeting or do a meeting in that summer months, I would assume that the consensus would be to try to schedule within that week where council is already scheduled, so that you can make appropriate plans in the remainder of those other weeks. So I wouldn't be looking for every Tuesday necessarily, and I wouldn't be recommending that through the mayor in July and August only. And that, again, that isn't just for our own sort of schedules collectively, but quite frankly, the public, we get a lot of negative feedback if substantive decisions are made in those 8 weeks. It's just an observation I've seen sort of through past terms of council. They don't like the fact that it's being done, and they don't have access that would typically be there. So that's just kind of a caveat that I think it's important that you know too. It's kind of an area where you want to do administrative business. We don't want things to get behind, but we want to make sure that public participation remains the same. So if everybody's okay with that, the next item is, I want to just touch on briefly the council yellow folders. And these have sort of evolved sort of in their purpose and function. Maybe I'm not a big fan of them personally, because I find that you're getting inundated with materials at the 11th hour. So they're meant to be there to at least have for you on a council day items that we received after the agenda is published. And that's intentional. We want to make sure that you have essentially a week, or almost a week, from the Wednesday of publishing to the council meeting on the Tuesday, of the staff reports, the correspondence, the information that's on that next week's agenda. Right now, the process then allows for an amended agenda or an updated agenda to be published on the Friday. And that's where you then get deputation requests. But again, we moved the time frame back collectively from the following week so that it gave you at least the maximum amount of time to be able to take that additional information in, have the weekend to review it, and then when you went on Tuesday, council, not individuals, had all of the same information in front of them. The yellow folders were then intended to kind of be that supplementary piece. So if a deputant was going to be speaking on Tuesday, they may have their notes. And so they hand the clerk the notes. We provided them in the yellow folder so that you had something to follow along with. A presentation may not have been published in the agenda, but there's photos or other sort of background information. It's getting received in the public record on the Tuesday, so we've included it in the yellow folders. It's starting to expand beyond that. So now you individually, or maybe at a council meeting that morning, somebody's coming in and saying, I took 50 photos on the weekend and I want council to see them all. We're sort of doing best efforts to try to respect that input, but unless you receive all of this, unless you get as a body all of the same information, like you're not making the same informed decisions. And so we want to start going back to sort of regulating what's in those yellow folders and actually rejecting some last minute handouts because you're not getting an opportunity to take them in. If they are provided in a yellow folder or after the 2 agenda cycles, the mayor is going to be asking that they be received for the public record and minuted as part of the input. So I just wanted to have that item flagged because I know you're getting a lot of questions, and we're seeing it in the last couple of cycles, where on the weekend prior to a meeting, people are handing you individual sort of information, or they're trying to email you or trying to email all of council. That can't happen because that's advancing, I'll go back to my original comment, that's advancing the business of the city, but it's not being shared sort of either in a coordinated manner, and it's not received on the public record. So I just wanted to put that out there. I'll maybe pause there if anybody has any sort of insights or comments or questions on that. But we want to be very deliberate that that information is consistent, that everybody gets it, and that the public knows whether you've received that additional piece of information as a body.
Councillor Warren.
Through you, that's good information, and thank you for that. But I have a question for the clerk. This comes in our yellow folders for pecuniary interest or whatever, or our notifications. Do you prefer? I send mine by email. So do you prefer it to be written out or sent in an email?
It could be sent in an email, as long as there's a written notice. Written notice could be emails, it could be a Word document, it could be handwriting. It just provides council the opportunity that once they get into a meeting and they realize either they have announcements or pecuniary interest, that the form is available to you. So it's just out of convenience.
Councillor Ashmore.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we should keep it the way it is. I have no problem even right up to the last minute. It's not just public that put information in these folders. It's, for example, the last meeting, Councillor Perry had the road that we discussed, and it was for our education as councillors that he put in there, and those pictures did help us make that decision. So it's not just residents that put information in here. I think we really shouldn't censor what goes in these folders and decide who can or cannot be placed in this folder. I think everybody should have the right up to 1 o'clock on that council day to put something in here, because that's the way it's been, and I think that's the public's right to have information received in this here. Like, to me, this is really important, even if it's paper. And even if it's one little piece of paper, one email printed off, or one letter, it's just as important as anything that's in the agenda. So I'd like to keep it the way it is. Maybe old-fashioned, but I think it's important that we don't censor people and we don't stop people from putting information in there, so.
I appreciate that, I think, but again, right now, you're not receiving it for the public record. So that's the gap that I see. You may receive information up till 1 o'clock, but the public that's doing a deputation or inputting into your decision as well isn't privy to that same information. So this is really just highlighting that if council wants to receive all of that correspondence, that it's at least recommended through the mayor that it should be received on the public record. So it will be read in, it'll be walked through sort of what's in that folder. That's going to bog down some business, but conversely, not everybody is seeing all of the information. Both individual council members, the public, and or staff that are trying to inform and make recommendations as well.
I agree, like maybe it should be like, we do receive it. We do receive what's in these folders, but perhaps after the meeting, it should be scanned and then put into the minutes that we received them. So we scan everything that was in those folders. Maybe that's another idea, I don't know. But we always would receive what was extra correspondence. I think it was classified as extra correspondence.
You've never received what's in them purposefully and in the records. Like, you individually are receiving them and getting them, but they are not being read into the record and they're not being shared sort of after the fact. So it's really more a heads up that going forward, if that's a practice that council's generally comfortable with, it's just with that added recommendation that we want to formalize and receive any and all items of correspondence, photos, etc., that informed your decision or recommendations for the public record. So to your point, it would be included and read into the record and in the minutes and formally received as council.
And you also get the deputant who comes, and at the time of their deputation, they go, oh, here, I have this that I want council to see. And you know, we don't have time to properly look at it or read it or do anything else with it. It's last minute. All we're trying to do is manage the process so that we're open and transparent, and that everything that comes forward to council, everybody has an opportunity to view it and see it.
I think everybody gets the same in each one of these folders. Nobody gets anything different.
But the public does not.
That's true. So I think that we should scan what was put in here as a matter of record after in the minutes.
So let's suppose we have a planning issue where you have some deputants come forward who are in favor of a particular planning activity, and there are some who are not in favor of the activity, and at the last minute, one group comes forward and hands in something to council, we want you to see this. But the other people who are not in favor of the planning activity didn't get to see it. They didn't know anything about it. It's last minute. How is that fair and open and transparent to all of the public?
I agree, like somebody's doing a deputation and they hand you a piece of paper, like, that's not right. I mean, that, what I'm referring to is, these are things that come in during the weekend or say before the beginning of the day. But I did mention 1 o'clock, but I mean, perhaps we could have a system where we could, you know, record what was handed to us physically in a physical piece of paper, because we do get quite a bit of stuff, and not stuff, it's important documents that are from the people that want to have us see it, but receive it, more than just receive it, but scan it and record it for the record.
Quite often, we receive pictures and other documentation that doesn't have any identity of who actually submitted, who took the pictures, who submitted the information. It might be in notes, but it doesn't say who the author was. We have certain criteria for deputations and correspondence and petitions that they have to identify themselves and their contact information. And quite often the things that we receive at the last minute for the yellow folders don't contain that kind of identification.
Councillor Joyce.
I'm generally more in favor of getting material ahead of time. It's just the way I operate. I find it, like, on one hand, yes, it's more flexible for constituents and deputations to provide the information in the yellow folder, but now I'm trying to listen and looking at new material and trying to make a decision. And but that's just how I work. That's would be my preference. The other concern would be is it could get out, as time goes by, it gets out of hand. Next thing you know, we have a very
That's what we're trying to
yellow
avoid.
folder. Yeah, so.
Councillor Perry.
Yeah, just wondering, just on that, from my understanding though, we can still submit things to the yellow folder, only at the time of debate or discussion, it will be read into the record, correct? So nothing's really changing except for reading into the record.
Yes.
Is that my proper understanding of the situation?
Correct.
Thank you. That's good. Okay.
I'm going to add one more. I'm going to add one minor thing, and we're still going to continue to screen it though for what goes in it in the first place. So if it's a photo that's unidentified and it said, give this to 9 councillors, we're not going to do that because it doesn't meet your criteria. But if it's the supplementary stuff, just like you've seen, and we receive it for the record, it meets those 2 pieces of criteria. That's all.
Like Councillor Joyce, I tend to enjoy things in advance as well. Just wondering, though, in life, last minute happens, right? So how can we have some kind of safety valve where we as elected officials can present things to each other should it be a last minute matter? That's all.
Well, I think we'd be judicious, and if it was germane and material to a particular issue, then we'd make the appropriate accommodations.
Thank you.
So piggybacking off of our committee of the whole, I'm committed to getting you at least out by 3:30. How's that sound? But I will leave it up to you how far you want to go beyond that. We're almost at the end. Sorry? You want more?
Well, you may want to argue about this one then.
So council memos so we're down to sort of 2 items and this is the last slide, by the way, so you'll be good to know that's the only other 2 items we wanted to touch on. So council memos are intended for you to bring new business that's not planned otherwise on an agenda, and they're more specified, specific issues. The idea being, and the format being a memo, is that it also describes or gives some background and context. Mainly for you yourselves, for your colleagues, so that when you're bringing forward a suggestion or a motion or a recommendation, that you have the best information and background. So that's how they're structured and why they're there. Committee of the Whole, it typically comes through that venue because it's not on an agenda, just like any of the other deputations and so on. So it's a good opportunity to bring that forward. We did touch on over the summer months, if the mayor deems it to be time sensitive, or we simply want to keep business going, that we would accommodate and allow for those on those summer agendas where we don't have Committee of the Whole schedules. We want to formalize, or we're just sort of going through sort of a process of those memos so that we can essentially help you. And I'm finding, just observing some of the iterations, we want to make sure, so we, the administration, want to make sure that you have the best background information so that when you're bringing something forward, you have that context as well. Because very often an issue you might want to bring forward, there's been a complaint attached to it, so there's a history. It may have been a decision that a previous term of council made. It might be guided in a policy that we have. So the intent when you first bring in a sort of concept is, let's just run it through the machine, if you will, so that we can provide you with all of the information and provide that. Certainly not intended to say don't do that, or we don't agree, or we don't see it that way. It's purely, in my mind, an administrative function where we're saying, here's all the information that's sort of connected to this idea. You take it and run forward as you will. The mayor then approves which ones come forward because they're not on a fixed agenda. So we've started to prioritize them to try to help with agendas and also to help just with being able to support them moving forward with information. So the mayor's sort of targeted 4 per Committee of the Whole meeting as sort of council memos or new business, if you will. So I'm hoping that process is working. We're gonna formalize it a little bit better just so that everybody knows what the timelines are, because just like staff reports and so on, in order to meet agenda deadlines, we're making sure that your memos are sort of running through a similar time frame so that we can get them on the agenda, make sure that they're there for the public to see, and make sure that you're comfortable with what's at least being recommended or what other information is there. So maybe I'll pause there. I don't know, you go ahead, Mr. Mayor, if you had any other.
Yeah, that doesn't apply to June 6th. All the memos that came in are on the June 6th agenda. But going forward, I felt it was best to try and limit it to 4 because they're at the end of the agenda, and if the Committee of the Whole meeting's going long, I don't think that we give due attention to those memos necessarily. We sometimes rush them through. So I expected in the early terms of council there would be a lot of memos, but as we go through the term, I would think those memos would get fewer and fewer. Those are my thoughts anyway. So Deputy Mayor Richardson?
Thank you, and through you. And actually, I'm going to say I'm a culprit this last month. I wrote a comprehensive memo, and staff brought it to my attention that, hey, you know what? We need to see how some of this, Bill 97 is going to roll out, and, stop right now because, I would be creating more work twice. So I have to say I have to recognize staff for making that suggestion because, every time we do bring something, we are creating work. So sometimes I think being flagged like that is very beneficial for all of us sitting around the table, right? Because sometimes, there is outside sources that we don't recognize that are actually making an impact until you actually get it flagged. So I like the process, so thank you for that. Now, just one quick question for clarification. So if we were to put a memo, are we going to set like some type of a deadline so we're not just pushing it at Kia at the last minute? Are we going to prescribe something a little bit better?
You're going to get a list of when the memos must be in. Okay? Councillor Warren.
Thank you, through you, and that makes total sense to vet them first. So I'm just wondering how they'll roll out. Let's say you have 10 of them, hopefully not, and you vetted them, and, you know, who gets to decide, you know, which ones go first? How does that, how's the process gonna roll out?
The process
As you
will
see
be first come, first serve, unless something is time sensitive. And are we going to be absolutely rigid about the 4? We may allow an extra one if, you know, if we look at them and there are 5 memos there that really need to be dealt with, we'll deal with the 5. But what we're saying is, let's try and keep it to 4. It's also to your other point about trying to find ways to shorten committee of the whole meeting. It may help there too, although I don't see that it's going to, you know, be a huge time saver. Councillor Perry.
Yeah, just on that, Mayor, I'm just curious in terms of the triage system, or, you know, because to me, if you look at what was on the slide earlier, number 1 for what we do is represent our constituents. And to me, the memos are the most important part, arguably, of what we do. It's the people's business. So perhaps, rather than have the agenda drive the substance, perhaps one consideration was we put the memos up after deputations at Committee of the Whole. So the people's business is done first, and we're alive to it, and we're fresh at it, and then the reports and presentations could fall after. I don't want to get into minutia. I'm just trying to make the point that I'm very leery of a seemingly arbitrary 4 cap when we have rights as elected officials and councillors to bring forward business and have it considered at this table.
Well, I guess my response to that is, and Deputy Mayor and Councillor Ashmore can attest, we have gone absolute months and months and months without ever having a memo in the past, have we not?
Thank you, through you. Absolutely. I mean, my last term at council, we were going through a pandemic as well, so the business was pretty status quo as well. But I think there's a process, you know, when we go through budget decisions, and, you know, for certain things, I think maybe we could look at that scope a little differently, right? Because it's like I said, it's a learning curve that's going on around this table right now. But last term of council was a little bit different. Maybe Councillor Ashmore can add something.
Yeah, I think memos are really crucial to getting your constituents' views out, and I know I put a lot of them into Committee of the Whole, and I just crank them out, and the more and more I put them out, I just, you know, hopefully the mayor, the chair, allowed pretty well most of them on. I really think that, yeah, we did. I don't think we had too many meetings that didn't have a memo on them, but okay, there were maybe a few, but I really don't think there should be a cap. I think they're really, really important. I find they're the most effective. They were my most effective way of getting things done for people, memos. So I think they were probably the backbone of my work, I would say, putting memos together. And I always encourage councillors to do it, so I think they're great.
I'm not saying we're not going to do it. I think we're going to try it with the 4. And of course, any that carry over go to the next Committee of the Whole, and we'll see how it works. And if there's an uprising in council over memos, then we'll look at changing things. So, Councillor Warren.
So you know, not being here for the last 8 years, we really didn't have memos way back when. And what we did, we worked with staff. And we work with directors, and so a lot of the time that would deal with your issue, and so I think that's something. Okay, you can put an issue into issues, and work with your directors also, and maybe you don't have to put a memo in. It just seems like, you know, it's, oh, I've got to do this or do that. It's learning to work with your senior management team too, for the people. So that's a possibility too. that you don't always have to put a memo in, you can work with staff.
Councillor Joyce.
Thank you. I'm in favor of the memos as well, and we're here for long meetings. I mean, that's our job. That's what we're elected for. I don't have a problem with that. The key with human behavior, adult learning theory, me being in the conference business, I know this stuff, where we have this saying where the brain can only handle what the rear end can take. Okay, in the very taking vast amounts of research into one little capsule here, and you're basically every 2 hours, 15-minute break. And that's if we can do that, after 6 hours, you can be almost as fresh at the end as at the beginning. But as soon as you start going 2.5, 3 hours before a break, that's when we get tired and we start making bad decisions. So I'm just throwing that out there. I'm okay with long meetings, but we gotta, and it, more breaks does make a longer day, but we keep the brain fresher.
Gil.
All right, well, again, thank you for that feedback. Again, really my intent of flagging it was more, we're not vetting them as the administration to say, don't bring them forward. I think it's just to give you information to inform them. And if you feel they're time sensitive, we need to find a way to work with sort of staff, but more importantly, get you all of the information that you need to then have it run through the process. But we'll go from there. Last item on concluding, and there's not a lot to it, is more just in the future. We are still looking at we talked about enhancements sort of to, if you're working offline, in closed session, electronic type of participation. We are still looking at an option for electronic voting entirely, whether that's practically speaking a recorded vote every time, or it's simply just a way to do business. The wild card is if you're participating remotely, having that sort of system done properly, but it's just one that we wanted to flag and that we might be trying it out or testing it out in the future. But if you're in your living room zooming in, we don't have it, and that's where it gets a little bit difficult. And so we just want to make sure that the technology supports you entirely. And if we go to that next phase, you'll have to update your procedural bylaw. But it sounds like I need to amend the procedural bylaw for heads versus butt time anyway, so we'll bring it back at the same time. With that, Mr. Mayor, I'm just going to conclude and just say thanks for the time. I think these are important sessions, and I know they feel, again, a little bit formal, but I think they're necessary just to make sure that you know what is expected or what's imposed on you as the council members. And if there's any sort of feedback or follow-up, feel free to send it through to me and I'll share it with the respective team if you had any other questions that come top of mind. And we'll give you a bit of a break and we'll see you in the fall when we start to reschedule some of these other sessions again. Thanks for the time, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate it.
Councillor Ashmore, you had a question?
Just a question. So we will be able to continue having the option of electronic for all types of meetings, like committee of the whole and council, in case somebody can't make it to the meeting. It'd still be there. Okay, that's good. Thanks.
I need a confirming bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the special council meeting of May 30th, 2023. Mover and seconder. Councillor Warren, Councillor McDonald, all in favor. Motion to adjourn. Deputy Mayor Richardson, Councillor Joyce, all in favor. Thank you very much.